I was at my friend's wedding, but I saw a letter in which his wife was being blackmailed with treason, and we had to find out who was lying, the wife or the scammer. Hey Reddit, I need your input because I'm spiraling a bit here. This happened last weekend at my buddy Mark's wedding. I, 25M, was there with my wife, Sarah, 27F, and we were having a great time. The whole event was beautifully planned, great food, amazing decorations, the works. One cool feature they had was a table where guests could write letters with well wishes for the couple. You'd write your note, seal it in an envelope, and drop it into a pretty wooden box they had set up. So, toward the end of the night, I decided to write a letter too. As I approached the table, I noticed an envelope sitting there, not fully sealed. Before dropping my note in the box, I figured I'd help out by sealing this one properly. But as I picked it up, the letter inside slipped out. I know I shouldn't have looked, but a couple of words caught my eye: cheating and pay me monthly. Naturally, my curiosity got the better of me. So, I skimmed the letter, just to make sure it wasn't some prank, you know. What I read made my heart drop. It was an anonymous note claiming to have proof of the bride, Emily, 26F, cheating on Mark, and it was written as some kind of blackmail demand. The writer insisted that unless Emily started sending them monthly payments, they'd reveal everything. I was in shock. I mean, Mark and Emily are the sweetest couple I know. This couldn't be real, could it? I stood there at the table, holding this letter like it was radioactive. My first instinct was denial. There was no way this could be true, right? I mean, Emily has always seemed so devoted to Mark. But the wording of the letter was detailed, almost like it was written by someone who knew her well. Part of me thought it might just be a sick prank. Who does this at a wedding? But then again, the letter seemed too specific to be a random joke. It wasn't just vague accusations, it mentioned times, places, and even referenced what looked like fake evidence that was supposedly prepared. I figured I couldn't just sit on this. If it were true, Mark deserved to know. But this wasn't exactly the kind of thing you bring up in the middle of someone's wedding day, so I decided to wait until the party wound down to talk to him privately. The rest of the evening was a blur. I tried to focus on the dancing, the speeches, and the cake cutting, but the letter was all I could think about. Every time I glanced at Mark, laughing with friends or holding Emily during their first dance, I felt this knot of guilt in my stomach. I wasn't even sure what to do next. Do I show him the letter? Do I confront Emily? What if this all turns out to be a misunderstanding? By the time the guests started to leave, I knew I had to talk to Mark. I found him near the bar, thanking some relatives, and pulled him aside. Hey man, can we talk for a second? I asked, trying not to sound like I was freaking out. Mark looked confused but nodded, and we stepped outside for some air. As soon as we were alone, I pulled the letter out of my pocket. Look, I said, I wasn't snooping, but I found this at the wishes table, and I think you need to see it. Mark took the letter and started reading. I watched his face as it changed from confusion to anger to something close to disbelief. What the hell is this? He finally said, his voice tight. Who wrote this? This has to be a joke, right? I don't know, I said. I didn't want to believe it either, but I figured you'd want to know. Mark was quiet for a long time, staring at the letter. Finally, he said, if this is fake, someone has a sick sense of humor. But if it's real, he trailed off, and I could see the gears turning in his head. We need to figure out who wrote this. That's when the night took an unexpected turn. Mark was pacing in circles, clutching the letter. This doesn't make sense, he said. Who would do this? Who would even have something like this to say about Emily? I tried to calm him down. It could be fake, man. It might just be someone trying to stir up trouble. But if you want, we can try to figure it out. There aren't that many people here. Mark nodded, his jaw tight. Yeah, we need to figure out who wrote this. But first, do you think this could actually be true? That question hit me like a truck. I didn't know Emily nearly as well as Mark did. From my perspective, she was kind, sweet, and utterly devoted to him. But the letter had planted seeds of doubt, and Mark seemed to be wrestling with the same thing. Honestly, I don't think Emily would do this, I said, trying to sound confident. But if someone's willing to write something like this, they're either lying, or they know something. We need to figure out which. We decided to go back inside and quietly scope out the remaining guests. There weren't many left, it was mostly family and a few close friends who had stayed behind to help clean up or finish their drinks. Mark and I stood near the bar, subtly scanning the room. "Okay," I whispered. "Let's think. Who would have a motive? Is there anyone here who has a problem with Emily?" Mark shook his head. "Not really. She's close with her family, and my family adores her. None of my friends would pull something like this. Maybe someone from her side." That's when we spotted him, Emily's uncle, Brian. He was sitting alone in a corner, nursing a whiskey and looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Mark's expression darkened. "Brian's complicated," he said. "He's had money problems for years and hasn't exactly been a saint." "What do you mean?" I asked. Mark hesitated. "Let's just say he's made some sketchy choices in the past. He's borrowed money from Emily's parents a few times, and there were rumors that he tried to blackmail another family member a couple of years ago. Nothing came of it, but still, that was enough for me to be suspicious." "Okay, so he's a possibility," I said. "But let's not jump to conclusions. Could be someone else." Mark agreed, but I could tell he was already hyper-focused on Brian. "Let's talk to Emily first," he said. "If she's innocent, she deserves to know what's going on. And if there's any truth to this," he didn't finish the sentence, but I understood the implication. We found Emily upstairs, still in her wedding dress, laughing with a couple of her bridesmaids. Mark asked if we could talk privately, and she immediately looked concerned. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "We just need to talk," Mark said, his voice more serious than I'd ever heard it. We stepped into a small room, and Mark handed her the letter. "This was at the table," he said. "I don't know who wrote it, but I need to ask, Emily, is there any truth to this?" Her reaction was immediate. She gasped, covered her mouth, and started to tear up. "What? Mark, no. I swear, I have never done anything like this. Who would write this?" She sounded so genuine, so heartbroken, that I felt an immediate wave of relief. Mark did too, I think, because his shoulders relaxed a little. "You're telling the truth?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Yes," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "I would never betray you. Please, Mark, you have to believe me." Mark took her hands and nodded. "I believe you." Then he took a deep breath. "But we're going to find out who did this." Mark and I left the room, determined to get answers. Emily's reaction had convinced us that the accusations were baseless, and now we needed to focus on finding the person behind the letter. Among the remaining guests, one stood out, Brian, Emily's uncle. He sat alone, sipping whiskey, looking uneasy. Mark mentioned Brian's history of financial trouble and questionable behavior, which only fueled our suspicion. We approached him calmly, hoping to keep things discreet. Mark placed the letter on the table in front of Brian, his expression tense. Brian initially acted confused, brushing off our concerns, but his discomfort was evident. He denied any involvement, claiming ignorance about the whole thing. Mark wasn't buying it. He pressed Brian, pointing out how personal the details in the letter were and hinting at his reputation for manipulation. At first, Brian resisted, but under the weight of Mark's calm but relentless questioning, he finally admitted to writing the letter. Brian confessed he had fabricated the accusations to extort money from Emily. He even admitted to creating fake evidence to make the claims look real. His tone was defensive, insisting it was a desperate attempt to fix his financial problems and that he hadn't thought it through. Mark was livid but stayed composed. The betrayal stung deeply, especially since it was a family member who had tried to sabotage the wedding. Without much discussion, we called the authorities to report Brian's actions, leaving him to face the consequences. Later, Mark shared everything with Emily, who was shaken but relieved to know her character was intact. The night had taken a sour turn, but at least the truth was out, and Mark could stand by his wife with full confidence. Brian, meanwhile, would have to answer for his actions. The police arrived within the hour, adding an unexpected and somber conclusion to what had started as a joyous day. Brian didn't put up much of a fight, though he tried to spin his actions as a desperate mistake rather than malicious intent. It didn't help his case. The officers took statements from Mark, Emily, and a few other family members who had been privy to the confrontation. As the news spread among the remaining guests, the atmosphere shifted. Some were horrified, others angry, and a few were quietly gossiping in disbelief. Emily's parents were especially devastated. They apologized profusely to Mark, visibly shaken that one of their own had tried to ruin such an important day. Mark was gracious but distant, clearly still processing everything. Emily, meanwhile, showed remarkable composure despite everything. She stood by Mark, offering quiet reassurance while privately battling her own hurt and anger. She later confided that Brian's actions had left her questioning how someone so close could stoop so low. The authorities confiscated the fake evidence Brian had created, which included doctored photos meant to back up his claims. It was crude but convincing enough to have caused serious harm if it had gone public. As he was led away, Brian gave one last half-hearted apology, though it was clear no one believed he was truly remorseful. Mark and Emily decided to cut the night short, thanking the remaining guests for their support but urging them to go home. They needed time to recover from the ordeal. Mark looked drained as he hugged me goodbye, muttering his gratitude for bringing the letter to his attention. The next morning, Emily sent out a message to the broader family, briefly explaining the situation and confirming that the accusations were false. The letter, she wrote, had been a cruel attempt at blackmail that had no basis in reality. Most family members rallied around them, though there were a few who tried to downplay Brian's actions as a mistake. Mark made it clear he wouldn't tolerate anyone defending him. Though the incident was over, its ripple effects were just beginning. In the days following the wedding, the shock of what happened began to settle. Emily and Mark tried to return to some sense of normalcy, but the incident had left its mark on both of them. Mark confided in me that he felt a mix of anger and betrayal, not just toward Brian but toward the family members who tried to minimize what had happened. Emily, on the other hand, focused on damage control. She was adamant about protecting her reputation and ensuring that no rumors spread beyond the immediate family. She reached out to close friends and relatives who hadn't been at the wedding, explaining what had happened and clarifying the truth. Her calm, proactive approach seemed to reassure everyone that the situation was under control. Brian's immediate family wasn't taking things well. His wife, Laura, called Mark multiple times, begging him to drop the charges. She claimed Brian was under immense financial stress and didn't mean any harm. Mark was polite but firm, telling her that Brian's actions were inexcusable and that they couldn't let it slide. Emily echoed the sentiment when Laura tried the same approach with her. Despite their resolve, the fallout extended beyond Brian's immediate family. Some relatives whispered about whether Emily's relationship with Mark might still be questioned, even though the evidence was proven fake. It was clear that the letter had planted seeds of doubt for a few people, even if they didn't voice it outright. Mark admitted he hated how something so ridiculous could still linger in people's minds. Meanwhile, the legal case against Brian moved forward. The fake evidence and his confession were enough for the authorities to charge him with attempted blackmail and forgery. His lawyer reached out to Mark, proposing a plea deal if Mark and Emily agreed to drop the case. Mark refused, saying Brian needed to face the consequences fully. Emily found some comfort in the overwhelming support she received from her friends. Many of them rallied around her, sending messages of encouragement and emphasizing their admiration for how she handled the situation. She threw herself into post-wedding thank you notes and organizing the gifts, trying to focus on something positive. Mark and I caught up a week later over coffee, and he admitted the situation had brought him and Emily closer. "If anything, this proved how solid we are as a team," he said. "I don't know how I would have handled this without her." Still, the hurt and embarrassment of having their wedding day overshadowed by such drama weren't going away anytime soon. Brian's actions had fractured the family in ways that wouldn't easily be mended. It was clear that his place at future gatherings, if he even had one, would never be the same. As weeks turned into months, the incident began to reshape family dynamics. Brian's arrest was a sore subject, but it couldn't be ignored. Some relatives sided firmly with Mark and Emily, believing Brian's actions were unforgivable. Others, however, tried to sweep the matter under the rug, claiming family shouldn't take legal action against family. Mark was especially hurt by his own parents' wavering stance. While they initially supported him, they began to suggest that perhaps Brian's financial struggles should be considered. "He's your uncle-in-law now," his mother had said during a tense phone call. Maybe a second chance is what he needs. Mark's frustration boiled over. A second chance for what? To try to blackmail someone else. He didn't just make a mistake, he made a choice. Emily's family, meanwhile, was united in cutting ties with Brian. Her parents were devastated that someone they had trusted could betray their daughter so thoroughly. They made it clear that Brian was no longer welcome at any family events. Emily's father even announced that he was helping prosecutors strengthen their case, offering to provide statements about Brian's history of erratic and dishonest behavior. The broader family began to fracture. Some relatives who were closer to Brian and his wife, Laura, claimed that Mark and Emily were overreacting, saying the situation had already caused enough damage. One even accused them of dragging the family name through the mud by involving the police. Social media only made things worse. Brian's wife, Laura, started posting vague statuses about unforgiving people who act like they're perfect. While she never mentioned Mark or Emily directly, the posts were thinly veiled attacks. Emily chose not to respond publicly but confided to me that it was exhausting to deal with this additional drama. "I just want to move on," she said. "But they won't let us." Despite the tension, Mark and Emily found solace in their closest friends and immediate supporters. They began focusing on their future, determined not to let the ordeal define their marriage. "This whole thing was awful," Mark told me one day. "But if we can survive this, we can survive anything." Brian's case was moving slowly through the courts, but Emily and Mark decided they didn't want updates unless absolutely necessary. For them, the priority was reclaiming their lives and the joy that had been stolen on their wedding day. Still, the fracture in the family was undeniable. Gatherings were smaller, invitations more selective. Relatives quietly chose sides, and some bridges, particularly between Mark's parents and Emily's, seemed irreparably burned. While Mark and Emily tried to focus on their own happiness, the ripple effects of Brian's betrayal lingered, a painful reminder of how one person's selfishness could leave scars that take years to heal. Months after the wedding, Mark and Emily made a deliberate decision to focus on themselves and their future. They threw themselves into building the life they had envisioned, choosing to renovate their home and planning a belated honeymoon to a tropical destination. These projects gave them something positive to look forward to, a way to reclaim the happiness stolen on their wedding day. However, the family drama was far from over. Brian's trial date had been set, and Emily's father remained steadfast in his support of the case. Meanwhile, Brian's wife, Laura, continued her campaign of half-hearted excuses and subtle jabs, now extended to family group chats. She wrote lengthy messages about the importance of forgiveness, framing Brian as a victim of his circumstances. "Everyone makes mistakes," one message read. "We're all supposed to be family. Why can't we just move past this?" Mark and Emily, however, refused to engage. Mark told me he felt their silence spoke louder than any argument they could make. "People know the truth," he said. "If they still want to take Brian's side, that's on them." Eventually, some family members began reaching out privately to apologize for doubting Mark and Emily. One of Mark's cousins admitted she initially thought they were being too harsh but later realized how serious Brian's actions had been. "You were right to stand your ground," she said. "What he did wasn't just hurtful, it was criminal." Despite these small victories, the divide remained palpable. Family events became a delicate balancing act. Emily's parents refused to attend anything where Brian or Laura were present, while Mark's parents awkwardly tried to include everyone. This led to uncomfortable compromises, with smaller gatherings held in separate groups to avoid further conflict. One unexpected source of healing came from Emily's friends. They organized a small dinner party for her and Mark, dubbing it a do-over celebration. The evening was filled with laughter, heartfelt toasts, and a clear sense of love and support. For the first time in months, Emily said she felt like she could breathe again. "It's nice to be surrounded by people who don't bring any drama," she told me afterward. As the trial date approached, Mark and Emily braced themselves for another wave of stress. They both agreed that, while justice was important, their primary goal was to put this chapter behind them. "We've already lost enough to this," Emily said. "I just want to move forward." Their strength and unity became a quiet inspiration to those who supported them. While the family remained fractured, Mark and Emily were determined to rebuild their lives, one step at a time. The trial against Brian finally began, marking the culmination of months of tension and preparation. Emily and her father testified about the impact Brian's actions had on their family, detailing how the forged evidence and letter could have destroyed Emily's reputation and derailed her marriage. Brian sat quietly through most of the proceedings, his usual bravado gone. His lawyer argued that his actions were a result of desperation and poor judgment, painting him as a man who had made a mistake rather than a deliberate criminal. However, the evidence was damning. The forged photos, the letter, and his confession made it clear that Brian's actions were intentional. When the verdict came, it wasn't surprising. Brian was found guilty of attempted extortion and forgery. The judge handed down a sentence of 2 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after one. Brian's wife, Laura, wept openly in the courtroom, but Mark and Emily felt a quiet sense of closure. Justice had been served, and the truth was undeniable. The aftermath of the trial brought mixed reactions. Some family members expressed relief that the ordeal was finally over, while others remained bitter. Laura continued to claim that Brian had been unfairly treated, though her protests grew quieter as time went on. For Mark and Emily, the trial's conclusion marked the start of real healing. They no longer had to deal with the looming stress of legal proceedings, and the resolution allowed them to move forward without lingering doubts about whether they had done the right thing. Emily's parents were particularly vocal in their support, reaffirming their pride in how she had handled everything. "You've been stronger than any of us could have imagined," her father told her one evening. Emily said that hearing those words meant more than she could express. Mark and Emily also began reconnecting with parts of the family that had remained distant during the ordeal. While the relationships weren't fully repaired, there was at least a foundation for rebuilding trust. Mark's parents, who had been hesitant to fully condemn Brian, quietly apologized for not standing firmer behind him and Emily. While their apology was late, Mark accepted it, choosing to prioritize moving forward. With the trial behind them, Mark and Emily finally embarked on their honeymoon, a much-needed escape from the chaos of the past year. As they relaxed on a sun-drenched beach, Emily told Mark, "I feel like we've finally closed the book on all of this." Mark smiled, taking her hand. "We didn't just close it. We wrote our own ending." After their honeymoon, Mark and Emily focused on rebuilding their life together, leaving the chaos behind. They poured energy into their home and careers, finding peace in small, shared routines. Family gatherings remained complicated. Some relatives sought to mend relationships, while others stayed distant, but Mark and Emily chose to prioritize those who had supported them. 1 year after the wedding, Emily's parents hosted an intimate anniversary party. Surrounded by close friends and family, Emily spoke briefly about the strength they'd found in each other and the people who had stood by them. The night ended with a quiet backyard dance under string lights, free of tension or conflict. Though scars from Brian's betrayal lingered, Mark and Emily emerged stronger, their bond unshaken. Together, they looked ahead, ready to embrace a future built on resilience and love.